If you think I'm just gonna sit here and start glazing Slay the Spire for being the best game of all time and that there's no point in making a sequel because they couldn't possibly make it any better, you're only half right. Yes, Slay the Spire is probably the quintessential roguelike deck builder that inspired the entire genre, but it relies on fairly straightforward mechanics and a classic card game style to accomplish this. Many of its contenders have expanded and built upon these concepts to produce new and exciting deck builders that push this definition to its limits. The competition has slowly crept further and further into the spotlight, creating a challenging field for new games just trying to enter, let alone old games trying to redefine themselves without the advantage of fresh takes on the genre to ensnare players' attentions. Slay the Spire 2, as a consequence, has a fundamental question it needs to answer. How do you improve a game from 9 years ago that many consider the perfect roguelike card game, all the while keeping hold of the humor and atmosphere that made the Spire so spiry? You may consider this a foolish task, and maybe one not even worth attempting for fear of ruining the brand. However, there is a way to have Slay the Spire 2 not just meet, but exceed the popularity of the first if it can just dodge a couple pitfalls, and from what I can tell so far, Metacritic may be just on the edge of accomplishing the impossible. There's always a ton of problems to tackle when creating any new video game sequel, and Slay the Spire is no exception. Note that Slay the Spire is a direct sequel, which means it's attempting to build on top of the established lore and gameplay of the original, not create a secondary spin-off branch or a spiritual successor that would have thrown us into a completely different game altogether. Direct sequels like these are of course limited first to their medium, in this case, a card game. Unlike games like Peglin, which switch out the cards for orbs on a pegboard, or Astrea, which implements dice as powered up numerical effects, Slay the Spire is unable to expand into different premises that these other games did, which capitalize on them being the first of their kind to shake up the standard deck builder. This includes the settings, the characters, and the general gameplay loop. For example, could you imagine Slay the Spire if there was no spire to climb? Okay, maybe that one isn't a huge problem, besides being a misleading name at that point, but what if we were to make some kind of progressive journey without the Ironclad, the Silent, or the Defect as our main trio? Yeah, I was also scared by the initial trailer info about the Defect until we got this epic scene last week. Chills, bro. Literal chills. Losing any one of these characters might be acceptable, but without any familiar faces that we're accustomed to, we'd be quite angry and confused why these beloved characters were removed. Not to mention, if we weren't using cards anymore and switched to dice or something, it would have absolutely changed this into a different game with different rules, as this would affect the entire way we fight enemies and collect powerful cards along the way. So that means several things have to stay the same, especially including the concepts tied to each character's image. The Ironclad as a bulky swordsman, often boasting cards that hit hard or build mountains of block. The Silent as a swift assassin, tossing quick shivs and poison onto the field. The Defect commanding orbs at their leisure, a mechanical construct of mystical power. And the Watcher, a monk with anger issues. Just because the three main characters are in Slay the Spire 2 doesn't mean their in-game mechanics have to be the exact same, but you probably won't see the Ironclad flinging around poison at any point, or the Defect bashing enemies with a sword as a matter of principle. Honestly though, these are the kinds of things that we players don't want to be changed. Yes, there are limitations on the game devs, but I doubt they even wanted to see these changes as part of the games in the first place. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? In fact, it's imperative that Slay the Spire 2 keeps the same atmosphere and visuals that old players rely on while improving on them in key ways to draw in new players. Recurring NPC characters should return as well, like the shopkeeper and Niao, and even some key enemies and boss characters. These are not necessarily must-haves, but they are tried and true ways of keeping the continuity from one game to the other intact, emphasizing that the game is indeed a sequel. So if Metacritic can't change any of these aspects of the game, what can they do? Well, as I'm sure most of you can already guess, the answer is add more of everything. In other games too, whatever the game used to succeed, simply adding new iterations of those things is usually the first place devs should start with. For Slay the Spire, clearly there are a lot of places that can benefit from this philosophy. There could be new cards, new enemies, new heroes, new events, new music, new relics, new potions. There's so much excitement that we could get just from these things, and they're the exact same features already available in the original. The real key to their introduction though, is that we'll have access to new abilities and effects that we haven't seen before. Outside of the actual gameplay, there are some obvious areas that all sequels can improve on. First, there's the visuals. Now, Slay the Spire isn't a particularly hi-fi game, but I want to throw some kudos to the artists for somehow upgrading the designs of the characters, the background, the cards, the shops, everything, without really dropping the vibe of the original. Same with the new animations. I love how these power effects and enemy actions are starting to turn out, and we haven't even seen all the content that's available yet. Something unique to Slay the Spire that I hope stays in the game too is the humor. Small quips or funny comments and the limited dialogue we get throughout the story, as well as almost comical events in the game, are really where Slay the Spire gets its charm, and I hope they'll keep these antics up in the sequel. As for the gameplay loop, let's focus on the cards first. Some new cards will simply remix existing mechanics in fresh ways. New cards like Bully and Aggression on Ironclad weren't in the original, but don't introduce any new keywords except to have different damage amounts and secondary descriptions. That doesn't mean they aren't fun and intriguing, just exemplifying that having new cards doesn't mean everything has to be thrown out and replaced. There are of course cards that introduce new mechanics which can be applied to existing heroes, and more importantly, new ones as well. This is where the new heroes come into play, specifically the Necrobinder and the Regent. We were introduced early to the Necrobinder and shown that they play with two completely new card archetypes, Soul and Doom. Now I'm obviously going to try and keep this video as spoiler free as possible, but this is where the devs can really explore new directions for the game to go without stepping on the original's toes. Having no precedent, their concepts can be developed mostly from scratch and give them the gimmicks that are unique and new to everyone. These are the most fun in my opinion to play with as a returning player, since we're all figuring out how to make new mechanics as OP as possible. And that's the main thing that adding more of everything really needs to do. It must enable us to feel the same joy we felt when we originally picked up a Shiv deck and just started blasting through enemies, or managed to toke our deck down to our first infinite. That core memory of feeling our decks becoming stronger and stronger, slowly memorizing enemy attack patterns and navigating through dangerous turns is what Slay the Spire is all about. Sequels that focus on these aspects of the game instead of just randomly adding new stuff actually understand what made their game good in the first place and can back that curiosity up with relevant potions that have effects that could potentially save your run, or relics that enable a whole new world of beatdowns. Variety on its own will never carry a direct sequel, no matter how much new content is introduced. So what made the original Slay the Spire so good that I'm even worried about the high bar it set for the sequel? Well, adding in everything we already talked about, I'd narrow it down to two main concepts that by themselves made Slay the Spire a historically acclaimed game. That is, balance and replayability. I cannot stress to you enough how impressive it was that Megacrit managed to walk the thin tightrope between overpowered and underwhelming. From the cards themselves up to the relics and the enemies, the base game all the way up to A20 is somehow the most balanced gameplay I've ever encountered in my life. Are there still some builds that are better than others? Of course. But every build and every type of deck has a chance at going all the way if you play your cards right. What's the secret? Megacrit might tell you it was the extensive playtesting. I, however, disagree. I think it's something more fundamental than that, and it has to do with how each card and relic and whatever combos and synergizes with each other. Now obviously the most fun part about a build is that turning point when we get enough cards that push a particular mechanic and start feeling those combos actually kick in. In a Shiv build, yeah, it's fun to get your first Blade Flurry, but once you upgrade it and get accuracy and 1000 cuts, or after image for block while you're doing the damage, it all starts coming into focus. I think my favorite moments were when I picked up a wrist blade from Niao and I started going Shiv hunting for the rest of my run. And therein lies the beauty of the game. One card can change the whole direction of the deck. One relic could turn a mediocre build into an insta-win. It all comes down to Niao's favorite catchphrase: risk and reward. Just as much as having one powerful card could power spike your entire build, and one bad one could utterly ruin it, there's no guarantee you'll get any one item that you need. At the same time, it's not the card or relic itself that's so powerful, but the fact that it opens up one key piece of the puzzle. Getting Hyper Beam on the defect is useless as you're going Freeze Orbs, or acquiring a Body Slam on an aggro Ironclad. You could get the best poison card in the game, but if Catalyst has nothing to multiply, 0 times 0 is 0. But that too is a slightly misleading statement. No card is objectively useless, but there are situations where they are good and situations where they are objectively bad. And these can depend on timing, current builds, upcoming boss battles, and more. No one deck has a good time against everything in the game, and that's the fundamental balance that Megacrit understands so well. Along with balance, replayability ties right into the depth and breadth of the archetypes available to us. The variation of heroes, with each having at least two mechanics and abilities that help define what they're capable of, creates a ton of variation for us to latch onto. Due to the nature of randomness in the game, no two runs are ever exactly the same, and even if we can create a similar type of deck, it's easy to mix and match the exact cards and relics we acquire, while still maintaining a power level that feels on par with random enemies and bosses that become easier or harder to take down next time. However, and this is the key difference, Slay the Spire did not go overboard with this variety. Yes, it boasts a large amount of unique combinations, along with card rarity to spice up the frequency, but it was just enough to make every run a gamble as to what power-ups we were given, and not so many that we could never reproduce the same OP build again because there were too many irrelevant powers in our card pool. Not to mention, there are very few select relics and cards that specifically target one archetype, and most others are just general cards to boost card draw, sustainability, or defense. So when Slay the Spire 2 adds all of these new additions, they need to build on top of these two tenets that Slay the Spire got right. If either the balance or the replayability of the game is not at least matched in Slay the Spire 2, it'll ultimately fail as a sequel. Personally, I'm filled with a lot of hope for Slay the Spire 2. Just based on the information leading up to the early access release, it really sounds like Megacrit is focusing on the right things that would make the sequel a certified step up from the original. Of all the things that we know about, there were 2 features that astute viewers may have noticed I haven't mentioned yet, and these 2 features really stood out to me as the most important upgrades to the game: procedurally generated act variation and cooperative mode. To go in order, obviously Slay the Spire had procedurally generated decisions already. Sometimes we'd get Hexaghost or Time Lord, sometimes the Champion or Slime Boss, but the things that stayed the same were the mini-bosses and the potential enemies in each act. Now we're being told that each act may actually behave more like its own biome, and depending on where we actually get dropped, there's potential for different enemies in combination with different bosses. Now I don't know exactly if enemy types will always line up with the boss type, but it's a good way to increase the variety of the game without changing something hugely fundamental to what they were already doing. Then of course comes the main event, cooperative. Now, upon hearing this, I immediately felt both elated and anxious about this news. I don't know if many of you guys have actually played co-op card games or deck builders before, but I personally haven't. I'm sure some exist, but the closest comparison that I have is For the King. Now For the King and For the King 2 are actually just roguelite games where no actual cards are involved, but it operates on a similar principle that Slay the Spire appears to be going, where each player takes on 1 or 2 of the total companion characters and pilots those decks independently. My initial concerns start with the pacing of the game in co-op. I don't know about you, but when I play Slay the Spire, I speedrun my turns, checking exactly what cards I can play and what synergistic end goal I want to achieve. However, inherently, co-op is, well, cooperative coordination. If I don't communicate with my teammates and talk about what we're going to do so that we can maybe take down a minion before it gets a chance to attack, we might end up in a world of hurt. When playing For the King, this leads to turns that would literally last tens of minutes just talking through the attack order, positioning, potions, and other relevant items. And even in the overworld, there were mechanics that allowed us to decide where to move or what paths to take, much like Slay the Spire has already shown off. My fear is that of no fault of the game itself, co-op will become a whole new experience in a negative way, turning it into hours of excruciating thought and decision fatigue, really wearing down on our desire to replay it over and over. Now some of you may really like that, and if you find a group that enjoys that style, more power to you. But from a working 9-to-5 guy with friends all over the country, with different time zones and a desire to make YouTube videos, it really feels like if that's the direction co-op ends up in, I won't be able to take full advantage of this improved aspect of the game. Of course, you could argue that that's just a me problem and others like me problem, and you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but the main concern that I have, and the true hurdle that Megacrit needs to get right, is balancing co-op encounters. We still don't know a lot about co-op, and once we do, we might get a better picture of how this works, but if enemies are scaled to deal with the number of characters in play, that automatically creates a dynamic range of issues where balance is almost nearly impossible to achieve for all scenarios. Having 2 decks in play is vastly different than having 3, and this also assumes that decks aren't currently being shared between co-op characters or anything. Power scaling as a whole has to work with different synergies that are all happening at the same time, and there are certainly challenges with comboing hero effects in ways that actually compound strength the way that we enjoy in single player, rather than just chip away at bosses individually. This creates a potential viability issue that the original game didn't have. If only some combinations of poison, discard, block, etc. work with each other well enough to take down a super powerful boss, then any other options will simply be inferior to the most meta decks. One of the true wonders of the first game was that every gimmick felt strong, to the point that even if we preferred one kind of deck over another, sometimes we would have an itch to try something new, and that would also work in the end. If we lose this key aspect of the game due to co-op balancing, and Slay the Spire falls victim to min-maxing issues that other combat games have had, it would be a disaster. Paradoxically, because the original was so well renowned for this balance, these issues may be even more devastating to the margin of error that Slay the Spire has to work with. Can they do it? Well, if anyone can, it probably is Megacrit, but they've only shown their work once before. It's time for them to prove that they can do it again. Now that the game's out, I've seen that there's a couple co-op specific cards and ways to individually hold but use resources on each other with potions and such, so it looks like they're definitely trying to separate the co-op and solo experience, which is great. And of course, simply adding new features is never a bad thing for games, so this just adds to my confidence that co-op is going to be its own area that's a fun time with friends. By focusing on the core aspects of Slay the Spire 1 that we all loved, Megacrit is hopefully going to give us more of the original content with even more techniques to improve on its replayability, rather than branching off into new completely tangential paths, avoiding the common pitfalls that many sequels end up in. If you're curious what kinds of traps sequels can fall in for other games or even movies, check out this video next to hear more about that. And last thing I want to mention is that Megacrit is an indie game company, and closer to the fans than most other studios that I've seen. They've shown a great willingness to listen to their fans and interact with us on Reddit or through their Steam newsletters. As such, I'm 99% certain that if the community has issues during early access with balance or other gameplay mechanics, Metacritic will listen and try to remedy the problem. So while you're out there dunking on Donu and Deca, pun intended, keep in mind that just like Slay the Spire promotes replayability and diversification, when we get early access, we have a voice to add to the state of the game and can push it towards the right final form. As this video comes out, early access will have just started, and my first impressions are that it's still as fun as the original. It's a strange mix of old stuff that we already know, but with different art and events thrown in there, alongside some gameplay roughness that feels slightly out of sync with the old Slay the Spire, but I'm slowly getting used to the upgrade. I'm loving the co-op experience, and it definitely went better than I thought it would. Obviously, I'm nowhere near A20 yet, so the jury's still out on the true balance of the game, but I think it's on the right track for sure. I'll hold off on any real reviews until we've had some more time to adjust and see the game in its full glory. Hopefully though, we can help shape the state of the game that we want in a fair way, truly surpassing Slay the Spire 1 to create a worthy successor that'll capture our hearts for years to come. Thank you all so much for watching, and keep an eye out for more.